Now, we talked yesterday about what the main historical battle has always been for the church. The knowledge that we have lost over the last 100 years, that throughout history, first of all, the biblical battle is not for the salvation of the individual. The biblical battle has always been between the sovereignty of God and the sovereignty of man. Who will be sovereign? Who will be the boss of history? And then the next thing we saw is that when man tries to establish his own sovereignty over the sovereignty of God, he doesn't do it to win freedom from God as he claims to, because honestly all freedom comes from God, because that's how God started his law. He said, I'm Lord your God who brought you out of what? Of Egypt, of the house of slavery. Man, when he rejects God, he immediately chooses to go under dictators, to become part of a collective, to become part of a welfare state, or to become British or American. That is what we have lost. That the battle has always been between Christ and Caesar. But today we have individualized the battle and we have forgotten it. In fact, I showed you how our enemies are so confident that we are blind that the Fabians even choose for their logo a wolf in sheep's clothing. Why? They know that we have been blind for over a century now, and they can get away with it. Now, today we're going to talk about. This morning we're going to talk about another aspect of God's sovereignty, and that aspect of God's sovereignty applies to evangelism. If our evangelism does not reflect that main issue in the Bible, the sovereignty of God versus the sovereignty of man, and also if our evangelism does not reflect that historical battle, the sovereignty of Christ versus the sovereignty of Caesar, our evangelism is not true evangelism. Notice, I did not say it's not going to be effective. It will be effective. It can still be the wrong evangelism, and it can still achieve success. But unless we return to the right evangelism, we're not doing God's will. Okay? And that right evangelism must take into account the fact that the main issue in the Bible is the sovereignty of God versus the sovereignty of man. And also that the main historical battle that follows from that issue is Christ versus Caesar. When we talk about evangelism, there is no concept in the last 100 years that has captured more of the attention of the church worldwide as this one, as evangelism. Now, within the church, more books were written on evangelism than on anything else. I mean, we talk, we speak, we think, we brag about evangelism, how many people we have converted, where we have preached. More resources are spent on mission and evangelism today than in any other time in history. We have a talk yesterday with some gentlemen here. If you want numbers, only the churches in the United States spend a total of $2.5 billion a year on missions. From supporting mission organizations at home, to supporting indigenous missionaries abroad, to translation and publishing of Christian literature, or charity projects directly related to missions, or anything else, $2.5 billion a year is spent on missions by the American church alone. And if you want to translate it, because dollars are not really a good measure of value, if you want to translate it in some real measure of value, at today's price of gold, it is about 58.5 metric tons of gold every year. The American church is only on foreign missions only. And of course, this doesn't include the effort, the time, and the money spent on domestic evangelism within the United States. This is only on foreign missions. By my raw estimates, I'm a mathematician, so I like to make some estimates, and also I know history enough to play with some of the data. The same amount of resources at the value of 58.5 metric tons of gold is about as much as what the church spent on foreign missions between AD 30 and AD 1900. Now, I may be wrong, but not by that much. The church worldwide never really had a special focus on financing foreign missions or evangelism until AD 1900, when the World Volunteer Society for Foreign Missions was started in the United States. In fact, I think it started in Britain, but kind of developed fully in the United States. In fact, as late as into the 1930s, most missions and evangelism were done by volunteers. Not full-time, but not by full-time, fully supported missionaries with large bureaucratic organizations back home specialized only in raising money for missions. And what bang have we had for the buck? Negligible. For 19 centuries, the world was steadily becoming more Christian. Even 100 years ago, missionaries both at home and abroad still reported successes and success stories that we could only dream about today around the world. Now, what I suggest is find a book. It's available in Google Books for free. It was published in 1910, and it was published by that same Volunteer Society for Foreign Missions. The title of the book is Students and the Present Missionary Crisis, published in 1910, and it contains all the lectures and testimonies of missionaries from all parts of the world at the annual conference of that Students Volunteer Society for Foreign Missions in 1910. It's on Google Books for free. You can actually download this is the name, Students and the Present Missionary Crisis. You will be surprised at the difference with modern missions and evangelism, both at home and abroad. You'll be surprised at the optimism of the missionaries at the time. You'll be surprised at what reports they give about the success of Christian missions, including in the Muslim world. In fact, some of them claim that it's going to be another generation before the Muslim world becomes Christian. Some details you will see. In some details, a newspaper published in English and Arabic, owned by a rich Muslim merchant in Cairo, actually ran a series of articles asking, will Islam survive? And it came to the conclusion that unless Islam learns to build a civilization like Christianity did, it will not survive. Much better than sending troops abroad. The world was not falling away into darkness. And despite individual wars here and there, it was actually becoming one great Christian civilization with churches being built everywhere. China, Africa, Persia, and in many other places. And yet within the last 100 years, we have lost all the momentum our forefathers in the faith had accumulated. From a church that managed to survive the Roman persecutions, rise victorious when the mighty empire crumbled, and gain control in the direct history, we have been reduced to a whining, cowardly, small minority of insulated individuals. In that very same West that our faith made rise and prosper and become the greatest civilization in history. Why we don't even know our history anymore today. We don't even realize ourselves that the greatness of the West did not come from some mystical historical forces, or from genetic superiority, or from material circumstances, but from the profound influence of the creeds of the church on the formation of the worldview of the West. Our pastors don't realize it. They don't even know about it. A book by Rushdoony, R.J. Rushdoony, which is the most unique book ever written, I believe, in the history of Christendom. Never anything like that has been written before, neither after that. The Foundations of Social Order. A book that I think you all need to have at your house. And even though he didn't go to the very end to go in more detail, that book gives you something to think about, that actually everything that you see good in the West developed as a direct consequence of the creeds and the councils of the early church. When we know our history, we even refuse to pay attention to it. Why? Because it is condemning us today. Because when we compare the victories of the church in ages past and our impotence today, it is condemning us. And of course, our theologians and preachers today resort to creating theologies that not only justify our retreat and our failures, but also make them normative. Kind of a preordained, predetermined, cruel joke by God, who told us to pray, "Thine kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." but never actually intended to answer that prayer in any positive way. That's what our theology is today in the churches. We pray the Lord's Prayer, and then we preach, but God never intended to answer it in any positive way. But once we realize how much we differ from our ancestors in the Christian faith, and once we realize that it was possible for a small, courageous minority, no matter how weak and persecuted it was, to bring the mighty empire to its knees and actually change the course of history, through evangelism and the power of the Holy Spirit, we may start that process of redemption from our cowardice, passiveness. We may start asking ourselves, is historical decay really preordained and inevitable? It certainly wasn't for 19 centuries. If it is not, what's the way to return to that victorious evangelism? You know, not our modern evangelism, which just tries to snatch a few souls from the fires of hell and line them up at the bus stop to heaven, which I believe is a very twisted interpretation of John 3:16, but is very popular today. That old evangelism that turned whole cultures to Christ. The evangelism that made kings and princes bow before Christ. And even if they didn't have personal faith, still acknowledged Christ's authority over their realms because they were afraid of him. Psalm 2. And they were afraid of him exactly because the church presented him in evangelism exactly as he is. And also the church had the power of attraction to bring the masses to him. That old evangelism that changed history. It left Europe, went to other lands, started changing other lands, and brought to them God's peace, justice, and hope, even to the least of their subjects, even to the slave populations of the darkest places of the planet. A great example in the history of Britain is the ban on sati, the ritual of sati in India. In India, the ritual was that the wife of if the husband dies, the wife is burnt with him. And British governors, at least in the places where it was the places that were under their jurisdiction, because they were good Christian governors, banned the practice. There were riots in India, that same India of Mahatma Gandhi, the guy who believed in nonviolence, except to their wives. Now, how do we return to that victorious evangelism? What was the essence of it? How did they do missions in those days? What was the message? What are we missing today? Is there something important that our pastors and theologians and preachers today are not teaching us, and therefore are leaving us irrelevant and incompetent? How did the early church go about evangelism? Now, in order to understand it, I believe we need to go first to back to that institutional and organizational feature of the early church, the Jewish synagogue. We often make the mistake of associating the church with the temple and trying to see the model for the church in the Jewish temple. It's so convenient, you know, to make the church a limited institution responsible only for dispensing the religious experience on Sunday morning. Just another outlet for specific services. You need to have your car fixed, you go to the car repair place. You need groceries, you go to Walmart, to the grocery store. You need entertainment, you go to the theater. You buy a flat TV screen. You need to soothe your conscience, have some religious experience, you go to church on Sunday morning. But the church didn't start as the model of the temple. The temple is gone from the earth. It has never been on the earth in the first place. It has always been in heaven. That on the earth was just a shadow. We're coming back. The shadows are not here anymore. That shadow religion is gone. We got Christ in front of our eyes from now on. The early church followed the synagogue. And that's why Paul first went into what? When he visited the city. Into the synagogues. There was something important about the synagogue that we need to look at today. Their success. Let me give you some numbers. In the Roman Empire, the Jews of the diaspora settled almost everywhere in the empire. And usually they will settle in the big cities where the population, the bulk of the population of the empire was found. Paul was always looking for the synagogue when he entered the city, and the Jews were everywhere. Of course, the largest single Jewish community was in Judea and Galilee, but estimates show that that community was only between 1/3 and 1/4 of the total Jewish population of the empire. That means anywhere between 67 and 75% of the Jews of the empire were not in Israel, were outside, were in Rome, in any other city of the empire. Alexandria. Every city had a synagogue, and sometimes several synagogues. And the synagogue was started by families, not by a priest, not by a minister. And by the way, the Jews didn't have priests outside of the temple anyway. 10 families were the minimum number to start a synagogue, and they could invite a rabbi to reside in their community and be paid to teach them. And the synagogue was not just a place for worship. It was a community center. Its purpose was not to dispense religious experience, but, and I quote a theologian I'm going to be talking about in a minute, its purpose was to assume the function of a total society for its members. Were they effective? Enormously. Let's look at the numbers. And this is, again, I'm just gathering it from different sources, mainly from the Institute for Jewish History in Jerusalem. Between the end of the Civil War, won by Octavian Augustus in 30 BC, and Nero's suicide in AD 68, it's almost 100 years, the population of the empire, the whole empire, grew from 45 million to about 55 million. So it's about 10 million people more lived in the empire when Nero died. And there was a very low rate of about 0.1% annually. So every year the population grew by 0.1%, 0.2%. But the Jewish population in the same period grew at the astounding rate of 1% a year, which is 5 times faster than the general population, from 4 million in 30 BC to about 10 million in AD 68. From 4 to 10 million, more than doubled in 100 years. Never before and never after actually has the Jewish population comprised such a high portion of the world's population. By AD 65, the Jews were so numerous that they were about 20% of the population of the empire. You walk down the street, 1 in every 5 was Jewish. This growth, within a century before the destruction of Jerusalem, was due not only to natural birth rates. Conversion played a large role too. There was a huge process of conversion. Proselytes are mentioned many times in the New Testament, and many Greeks and Romans came to worship in Jerusalem, acknowledging it to be the source of the one true religion. Remember the Greeks that came to worship at the temple, John 12:20? Greeks came to the temple to do what? Worship. Given the fact that the Jews were not specifically oriented toward world evangelism, like the New Testament church, they were not going out of their way to win converts, like we do, this success is just striking. It's paralleled only by the success of the early church as testified in the book of Acts, and also by the missionary activities of some of the early missionaries and among the pagan tribes on the borders of the empire. The Jewish synagogue was a very successful model for evangelism, even if the Jews themselves were not committed to evangelism at all. And its success was especially remarkable in the big cities of the empire. What was the synagogue? The synagogue wasn't a religious institution devoted to worship on Saturday morning, like the modern church is on Sunday morning. It wasn't an outlet for catering to the need for religious experience among the masses. In fact, there was no religious experience in the synagogue. And that's why the Jews and later the Christians were often accused of atheism by their pagan neighbors. Oh, you don't have all these beautiful rituals that we have? You must be an atheist. You must not believe in God. Because what God is this God if you don't have the ropes, if you don't have the ritual, if you don't have all the bells and whistles of our liturgy? The synagogue didn't have any religious observances, no idols, no images, no special clothes for the priest, no spectacular rituals and sacrifices and prayers. The only formal ritual was reading of the law of God. Remember what Jesus did when he went to the synagogue? What did they invite him to do? Read from the law. And expounding on it. Luke 4:16 through 30. In other words, the synagogue was not a temple. It was community government. J.H. Bavinck, who is a nephew of the great Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck, has a great study on the science of missions. That's the title. It's called Introduction to the Science of Missions. Points to the fact that by becoming a convert to Judaism in the Roman Empire, a person became part of a comprehensive, self-governing, judicially and economically oriented civic community. And I'm quoting from him. A Jew enjoyed, this is a quote from J.H. Bavinck, a Jew enjoyed many civic advantages. The Jews who lived in the cities had a sort of government of their own and were states within the state. To a certain extent, they even had their own administration of justice, so that to belong to such a community was desirable for many. To belong to a community. Since the common people, the unthinking masses, could not think of a religion without idols, they might indeed say that the Jews were atheists. But those who came into a deeper understanding of Jewish worship were in one way or another influenced by it. And indeed they were influenced. The near explosive growth of the Jewish population in the century right before the fall of Jerusalem is an inadequate proof. End of the quote. The government of their own and the states within the state J.H. Bavinck was talking about were the synagogues. There was no other Jewish institution that could be the locus of that government. It was exactly in the synagogue where the Jews would go for their community decisions, for their justice, for their economic discussions, for help, for organizing their welfare services, for everything. The synagogue was meant to be an institution for dominion, a cultural beachhead in the pagan world. Do you have this word beachhead in English, in British English? Okay, you know what a beachhead is, right? If you've been to the military, you know what a beachhead is. A beachhead is Omaha Beach, or Normandy in D-Day. A small place where you establish a beachhead where you can advance further. Just a very small strip of territory. That beachhead was based on a different faith, and therefore on a different worldview, and therefore on a different cultural foundation, and therefore on different law, structure, and administration of justice. It was everything different. Under the principle in Deuteronomy 5 through 8, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, it couldn't remain unnoticed by the pagans. It was destined to become a force of attraction, actually. And it was a force of attraction. Pagans actually flocked to it and either became Jews by circumcision or adopted the Jews' ethical system for their own personal lives, their households, and their social activities. Acts 10, 1 through 2 is a good example. But what was that principle of Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8? And what was the message of that Old Testament evangelism? Our modern evangelical mind is so deeply existential today, so deeply Gnostic, so deeply mystical that it can hardly relate to any other message but Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. This is all our evangelism. Now, if the message is anything else but Jesus saves souls, thinks the modern churchgoer, it can't be a gospel message. It must be secondary to the gospel message. Because today, the gospel of soul winning has replaced the culture transforming message of the kingdom of God, preached by Christ and the apostles. What was the evangelical message of Israel at the time? Let's read Deuteronomy 4, 5 through 8. See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do this in the land where you're entering to possess it. So keep and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it, as is the Lord our God, whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I'm setting before you today? This is the original evangelical message. This is how the nations will look up to us and say, wow, Israel is a great nation. We want to be like them. This passage reveals that the evangelical message of Israel's mission to the nations was the law of God. It contained the message of personal salvation, of course, because the law itself was a revelation of Jesus Christ, God incarnate. John 5:46. We did much more. Israel was supposed to bring to the nations God's commandments for righteous living. Thousands of years before Francis Schaeffer, people were asking the question, how should we then live? Civilizations were never materialistic because materialism is never a cause worthy enough to build a civilization around. Even modern American culture is not materialistic. It's materialism is only the outcome of an underlying idolatrous faith. So if you see somebody who is a materialist, who is only concerned with things, you know behind that there is a spiritual problem. He's not just obsessed with things, he's obsessed with some idolatrous faith. People and cultures created law codes, established religious observances and mythological systems. Governments were based on ideas and shared experiences, but humanity has always been goaded, not by a desire for more material things, but by the quest for righteousness and justice individually and collectively. They didn't know where to find it, but they were goaded always by desire for righteousness and justice. Man is a cultural being, and in his totality, he wants righteousness and justice. As a man, as a society. His individual soul, his relationship to other men, his relationship to the part of creation that is under his power, is always based on some idea of righteousness and justice. So when man asked the question, how should we then live, Israel's mission was to answer, here's how, and start reading. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. That message embraced the cultural being, the man in his totality, and therefore in the midst of those pagan and idolatrous nations, Israel's mission was to preach culture, based on a law. Culture not in the modern twisted sense of ballet and theater buildings and TV shows and etiquette formalities and what's proper to do in Britain and all this stuff. But culture as a legal structure, interpersonal relationships, practical worldview and cosmology, institutional arrangements, ideology, philosophy of being, psychology, business relations, legitimate spheres of government, view of time, view of future, view of money, view of values, of everything. In short, true culture is everything that pertains to the totality of man. Deuteronomy 4:5-8 portrays the quest for righteous living that the pagan nations inherently have, and they would find the answers in the comprehensive law of God modeled in the nation of Israel, and that was the power of attraction that they were supposed to have. Israel was truly foreign to the Gentiles, foreign not just in the language and the customs, but foreign in bringing to the world a completely different culture that no one else had ever experienced before. We fainted, Rahab told the spies, when we heard of your God, and there is no courage left in any man. Many years later, the same confession was echoed in the words of Montezuma to Hernan Cortés, according to Cortés's biographer. He said the same thing, we fainted. The hearts of hardened veterans don't usually melt when they hear of another deity. Warriors faint only when they realize that there is no hope to save what they have fought for their whole life. When they realize that their whole world is about to die. Only then warriors faint. Israel was commissioned to preach laws and culture to the Gentiles that were foreign to the Gentiles and that were and still are the very essence of our modern evangelism. Prophets prophesied to the nations around Israel and condemned them for not obeying the law of God. Whoever tells you that the law of God never applied to the Gentiles hasn't read his Bible, because the prophets took the law of God and condemned the nations outside of Israel for not obeying that same law that God gave from Mount Sinai. Nineveh repented and obeyed the law of God. Nebuchadnezzar and Darius realized that the blessings of the God of Daniel came as a package deal with his law and obedience to that law. And that unique institution, the synagogue, was first and foremost that community center, a cultural beachhead, which was supposed to bring that law to the pagan lands outside of Israel. Without understanding this view of the purpose of evangelism as culture-bearing, there is no way to understand why Paul was so forceful in condemning Peter for separating from the Gentiles in the church. Have you ever thought about this? If personal salvation was all that there is the gospel message, then separating Jews and Gentiles in the church shouldn't be any problem. After all, no matter how we're separated, we're finally saved individually, right? But there was a reason why they had Jewish believers in the early church, and there was a reason why they had to be united with the Gentiles in the early church. Because Jewish believers who used the law and the culture created by that law were to be, for a time, foreign missionaries to those very Gentiles in the church who didn't know that same law and didn't know that culture, had to learn the culture and had to conform to it, because that was the goal of evangelism. The Council of Jerusalem recognized this new, in fact very old, role of the Jewish believers, and in fact established that which was to be accommodated by the Gentiles. Jewish teachers and preachers enjoyed very high status in the early Gentile churches. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, as the Epistle to Galatians testifies. But the Jewish teacher could go to a Gentile church and who would be immediately given the pulpit. Paul summarized the role of the Jewish believer, in fact. We actually read this only in the negative sense today. But here's what Paul said about the Jewish believer. Behold, thou art called a Jew. I don't know, I got it here in King James, but thou art called a Jew, restest in the law, makest thy boast of God, knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. And you are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, who has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Paul was not telling the Jewish believers, don't be that. He was telling them, you are that, but do you yourself obey the law? But they were supposed to teach everybody else the law and the culture that that law created. And the church then was instructed to take the culture it learned from the Jews and teach the nations to adopt it. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. How many times do we read that Great Commission, and how many times do we fail to see what it says? And it says specifically in Greek, and I don't care about the modern translations, that they say make disciples of all nations. Because in the original, in Greek, it says disciple the nations. A message of Isaiah's evangelist, your God reigns, was to be the church's evangelistic message. And the center of that culture was the law of God. And it's only logical for it to be so. A kingdom is defined by its laws, which of course include not only the state laws, but the whole system of rules for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in a culture, for what is proper and what is improper. We as Christians have been misled to believe that simply because we're not saved by obedience to the law, we don't need the law, and no one needs the law. We've been misled to believe that. The truth is, after we get saved, we will have to obey certain moral rules. We certainly place ourselves under a different set of rules than what I've been living under before. We have certain expectations of how a person should live after he's saved. Even those that say, oh, we don't need the law, and they say, I don't believe he is saved because he's not acting the right way. Also, you have a law. And if a kingdom or a culture or a civilization or a society is defined by its laws, then praying your kingdom come on earth is no different in practice than your law be established on earth. How do we know if God's kingdom has come? Well, Psalm 97:2. We know it by the fact that justice and righteousness rule. And how do we define justice and righteousness? By the law of God. When a nation is drowned in injustice and wickedness, that means it's against the law of God. We know that God is not its king. It's that simple. Evangelism, then, is a declaration of the kingdom which is at hand, and a declaration of a coming kingdom is invariably a demand for the people to submit to the law of the king. And the law of the king is found in his word. That's how simple it is. For most of its history, the church followed that model. It actively preached and taught a new culture, a new civilization based on the law of God. True enough, the church's understanding of the law of God wasn't always perfect. Sometimes it was plain wrong. But the focus was correct. The message was the message of the law of the king. The kingdom to be built and expanded was the kingdom of God, and the king was Jesus Christ. And the promise of Deuteronomy 4:5-8, that the nations will hear and say, these Christians are a great nation, actually worked in history. Europe was slowly but steadily transforming itself from a bunch of barbaric hordes on the edge of the planet into a robust, dynamic civilization which eventually brought the name of Christ to the ends of the earth by its conquests, commerce, and missions. But we have lost this today. And we have lost it because we have reduced evangelism to emotionalism and cheap promises of prosperity. We have abandoned the vision of an expanding kingdom, and we have adopted despair, pessimism, and irrelevance as the foundation of our message. And we're going to talk about it later today. We have convinced ourselves that the law of the king is not valid anymore, and thus we have told the world that we have nothing of value to give to it, because according to Deuteronomy 4:5-8, the nations will hear these people are a great people because they have a great what? Law. We have no answers to cultural problems. We have no answers to economic, judicial, scientific, technological, political, etc. problems. We have no kingdom, no culture, nothing to offer in place of the decadent pagan culture today, unlike those early Christians who had to offer something in place of the decadent pagan culture of their day. And thus, the church has lost its power of attraction. It must be obvious what we need to do in order to recover the evangelistic power of the early church. Let me tell you this. No matter how it looks to you, modern paganism has heard its death knell. It has heard it. They know it. They know their world is coming to an end, especially the elite. It is bankrupt economically, intellectually, psychologically, politically, legislatively. It tried to recreate the world without God, and it failed. Well, it took them 100 years, but it failed. It tried to recreate the historical civilizational success of the church, and it failed. It's running out of money, even out of its own cheap fiat money. It's running out of credit. It promised the world to its followers, and the moon to some of them, and it left them much poorer and disillusioned than their parents were. And it will face its consequences very soon. And it's happening in Greece, Italy, Spain, but also in the UK and in the United States. God is not to be mocked, for he controls history just as effectively as he controls eternity. And he uses history for judgment or blessing, just as much as he uses eternity for judgment or blessing. And he is coming in judgment upon this civilization. The question now isn't if the civilization will survive his judgment. The question is, do we as Christians have a biblical alternative to it? Do we have anything that will make the people of the world look up to the church again, once again, as the solution to the obvious failure of their pagan elites to deliver on their promises? Do we have an alternative culture that wants to bring oppression and misery in the name of welfare and security? Do we have a comprehensive answer to the comprehensive problems of our age? Yes, we do. The law of God as God's command to the world. I am the Lord God who brought you out of the land of bondage. Applied not only to the individual heart of man, but to his culture, to his laws, and his economics also. To the whole of man, to everything he is, does, and thinks. From his individual life to his political and economic endeavors. And that should be our evangelism, and it will once again be more effective evangelism than anything we have done in the last 1 century. All this mysticist, pietistic message addressing the ego of man, but not his real nature, his real life, and his culture. And once we have done our job in preaching the law of the king, the nations of the world will say once again, these Christians are wise and understanding people. Let's join them.